Good night, everybody. So, I just want to quickly share what my Supreme Case Justice was and who I chose. So, I specifically chose John Jay. I don't believe anybody else in the class chose John Jay as a Supreme Court justice. I specifically chose him because I've heard of the name before. He was the first Supreme Court justice there was. And he also had a very pivotal case, which I'll talk about, which is called Chisholm versus Georgia. Now, John Jay basically, he ran so everybody else can walk. And that's because he was one of the first to ever do it or to be elected into that position. So a little bit about John Jay himself as an individual. He was born and raised in New York in the 1700s. But he was also known as a child prodigy just because of his level of intellect. He ended up going to college at a very early age, or graduating high school around the ages of 14, around that age. He's very young. And from there is when he just continued to excel in his academic journey, which eventually led him to law and legislator and eventually to the Supreme Court. Now, the case that we'll be studying is Chisholm versus Georgia. Now, what is Chisholm versus Georgia? So this is taking us back to the American Revolutionary War. The American Revolutionary War, can't speak, has to do with what has a major part in why we celebrate July 4th and Independence Day and all of that stuff. But the American Revolutionary War took place from April 19th, 1775 to September 3rd, 1783. Almost a 10-year period, just about a little over 8 years. Now, what took place during this time, there was a man, his name was Robert Farquhar, and he was from South Carolina. He used to do his due diligence to supply goods to those soldiers who were at war and those who needed supplies, for example, linen, clothing, bed sheets, things of that nature, just to keep the soldiers warm and just to do his due diligence to his country, to his nation, as a form of servitude. But Robert Farquhar was also a businessman. And him selling these items to the soldiers at war during the American Revolutionary War was to receive a payment back. It was a service. He had goods and services. He wasn't from Georgia. He wasn't from the state of Georgia itself, but he was shipping his goods from South Carolina to Georgia. That makes sense. Just remember that note because it's going to be important and we're going to bring it back up. So with that being said, he basically was waiting patiently to get paid. Now, if you know anything about when a country is at war, especially America being at war at the time, the economical state of the country wasn't the greatest. So granted, it probably wasn't in their budget to pay him for his goods and for his services at the time, but it was still due to him. So Robert Farquhar waited patiently to get paid. He waited over a decade, even waited a few years after the war was over. And Georgia refused to pay him for the services that he gave to the soldiers. So I just want to read just a few of what he did bring. He provided linen, clothing, cotton, blankets, and other services to soldiers stationed in Savannah, Georgia. So that's a good point. Savannah, Georgia is known. It has a rich history in military. If you've ever been there, I've heard anything about it. But the American Revolutionary War is basically the war for independence, the war that allowed us to gain our independence. So when Robert Farquhar gave these goods, it happened in October 1777, which was 2 years into the war starting. The soldiers were exhausted and all of those things, so he's just doing his diligence to the country. Now, what happened is Farquhar passes away. He passes away shortly after. He passes away shortly after the war has ended. Now, what happens to the money that he's owed after waiting for it for so many years? That's where Chisholm comes in. Alexander Chisholm was also a South Carolina citizen, and he is the one who took place for Robert Farquhar and decided that he's going to seek compensation for the goods that were technically stolen from Farquhar. Right? And that's where we get the term Chisholm versus Georgia. Now this becomes a case that was brought to lawyers. Chisholm was very persistent, and he was not as patient as his counterpart, Farquhar. And it was something where even in his deathbed, he felt he had to honor. And I believe he was also a part of the business as well. So while he wasn't the main man in charge during the time that the goods were serviced, it still affected him. Hence, he saw a reason to fight for it. So the war ended in 1783. And then Robert Farquhar passes away in 1784. And then Chisholm comes, and he's bringing this case back and forth to the courts, and it officially makes its way to the Supreme Court in 1791. 1791 is 8 years after the War on Independence has ended. So I just want you to keep in mind the time frame of how long it took for this case to even get to the Supreme Court. And basically within this case, John Jay is a Supreme Court justice. There were other pivotal individuals of legislature, but John Jay was just elected to the Supreme Court about a year or two before this, and this was his first major case that was brought to him. And this is just very important. This is a big deal in terms of John Jay being one of the first persons to be elected into the Supreme Court justice. It's a big deal in a twofold way. It's a big deal in terms of John Jay being elected to that position, being the first one in that position, and also this being one of the first biggest cases in the Supreme Court, Chisholm versus Georgia, because of the war. And basically topics of such as authority and federalism came into play, and it took the forefront of this case. So the Chief Justice, John Jay, he had a major influence in this case, and just kind of questioning the integrity of the states. Are states allowed to take advantage of citizens? And this goes to question of integrity under the 11th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So after this, John Jay was the first Chief Justice, as mentioned, and he has a background in law and education. That's his education. And after he was elected to the Supreme Court, he fought for the right of Farquhar in his absence, but specifically Alexander Chisholm, who was taking over the case. And it was about 20 years after the war ended. It was fought in the favor, and one of John Jay's most famous remarks is that the states should not have that form of rule or rights over citizens. During this supreme case of Chisholm versus Georgia, John Jay wrote, "Sovereignty is in the right to govern, and here it rests with the people." So John Jay was a Chief Justice that believed in the right of the people, and he fought for that in this case. And shortly after that, Chisholm was awarded he was given recompense for what was stolen, and the decision was made in a 4-1 verdict in this case, the Supreme Court case of 1793, which is about 20 years after the war. But again, as mentioned, this is under the 11th Amendment of the United States. And what the 11th Amendment stated was that states aren't allowed to be sued without their consent. So the 11th Amendment is very important because topics of state authority, state to citizen relationships, and basically a hierarchy of things is what's broken down in the 11th Amendment of the Constitution. And it all mainly took place after this incident, or was ratified after this incident took place, because there was a superiority with the state. They basically didn't feel that they owed anybody funds, or that they had the right to disregard the goods or the services that were given to them. So that's just a little bit about the case, and I hope you learned something.